The story of Pocahontas has fascinated audiences from the time that John Smith first published writings about her in the 17th century to today. It's now fairly well known that the true story was quite different from Smith's account, and yet, Smith's version of events continues to dominate popular interpretations of this story, even those that attempt to be more historically accurate. Today on Historia Nostra, we're taking up Terrence Malick's 2005 adaptation of the Pocahontas story, The New World, and talking with experts about how this movie could be improved. I'm not an expert on Powhatan Confederacy history, or the history of Jamestown, so I spoke with two historians who are. I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hi, Erin. Hi, viewers out there. So my name is Fallon Burner, and I'm a historian who specializes in Indigenous history. I am also originally from the Jamestown, Yorktown, Williamsburg area of Virginia. So this story in history and the way it's been depicted has a particular place in my heart that's special.
Hello, I'm Rachel Bryant. I'm a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council postdoctoral fellow at Dalhousie University in the Department of English, and I work in literary history. My first book was titled The Homing Place. It was published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press in 2017, and that was a literary history of the Northeast, and it tries to occupy a space between settler colonial studies and Indigenous studies. I've done some work on John Smith and Pocahontas in the past, and that work was published in the journal Alternative, which is an Indigenous studies journal in New England. And I read them in the context of what I call kinship wrecking, which is a settler colonial storytelling mode that tries to destroy Indigenous kinship structures and obligations and citizenship obligations and replace those things with Western European notions of patriarchy.
The story Malick tells in The New World is riddled with historical inaccuracies. This video isn't going to address them all, and we aren't going to fully outline the real history either, because, as Fallon put it,
I don't want to crush someone's excitement for history by picking apart the plot for its historical inaccuracies.
But we will highlight a few things as we work our way through the plot. In this video, we sometimes called the Pocahontas character in this film Matoaka, which was one of her given names. At the beginning of the film, we see the English ships arrive in Powhatan territory, to the amazement of the local community, including Pocahontas. We're left with the impression that this was the Powhatans' first contact with Europeans.
Some of the Powhatan people would have already seen Spanish ships previously, or they would have heard stories about their parents seeing Spanish ships because the Spanish had come there and had a whole interaction. There's a guy named Paquiquineo, who's definitely worth looking up and reading about. His Spanish name ended up being something like, it had Louis in it. I don't know the European name, but so it was not necessarily the first time that Powhatan people saw or interacted with Europeans. So I think that gets really lost in the narrative every time it gets told. It's like, oh, Indigenous people who never knew anything about Europeans before. Like, that's not necessarily true.
Pocahontas, the favorite daughter of Chief Powhatan, or Wahun Seneca, meets and falls in love with John Smith, a handsome newcomer who is captured by the Powhatans. The Powhatans try to execute Smith, but Pocahontas convinces her father to spare him. Smith is allowed to live, but is warned that he and his people must go. This moment in the film also didn't quite happen, as we're led to believe.
It was part of a ceremony. He was, I think, held for weeks before that part of the ceremony took place, and he was taken to all of the villages, all of the Powhatan villages, and shown to the people, and that was part of the lead up to this part of the ceremony as well. So that moment where Pocahontas saves John Smith, it's such a lightning rod of a moment. You know, this is a moment of him being brought in, of the English being brought in, and of the Powhatans trying to control really what it was supposed to mean to be a settler colonist, to be an English person in this territory. And it's a sophisticated, fascinating process. A moment that is interpreted very differently, but I think when we look at it as an act of, as part of this larger ceremony, where the Powhatans are, expressing their political agency. They're performing a ceremony that was well established and was recognizable to people of those nations and remains recognizable. I think it's an important moment, just not for the reasons that we have decided.
Pocahontas helps the English survive the winter and falls out with her father as a result.
They have Wahun Seneca blaming Matoaka for giving the English the tobacco seed, and then the film makes it seem like she falls out with her father. But there are a lot of scholars of this topic who don't think that that's right. They don't think that Pocahontas and her father ever fell out. We have in the English historical record Wahun Seneca giving a necklace to Pocahontas, or Rebecca, I guess at this point, upon her marriage to John Rolfe. So would he have done that if he had disowned her? Would he have done that purely as a political symbol? I'm not sure. So I think that that's like something that deserves a little bit more digging into by motivated researchers.
Both films really develop this idea that Pocahontas acted independently of Powhatan, and that she acted against her own nation in trying to sustain the English. So I was just really struck while watching both films by how destructive that element of this myth is.
Smith leaves Jamestown to find a new route to the West Indies. She's told Smith has died, although he hasn't, and marries another man, John Rolfe. She's baptized and takes the name Rebecca. Pocahontas then goes to England to be presented to the Queen, where she sees Smith again. In our discussion about what the film did right with regards to Pocahontas, both Fallon and Dr. Bryant referred to a particular source.
So most of my understanding of this at this point comes from the book, The True Story of Pocahontas, by Linwood Costello, and he is a Mattaponi tribal historian. He's now deceased, but he provided this oral history from his nation of what happened with this story of these first years of Jamestown with Pocahontas and John Smith.
So, contrasting with Costello's account, I asked them what the film did well.
Her age, I mean, at least she's 14 in this, which gets closer to her actual age according to like the more of the indigenous accounts, or at least according to the Costello.
Pocahontas was very young when this all took place. Costello says that she was 10, or approximately 10. Other people have guessed, 12 or 13.
And I think that the choice to cast a 14-year-old actor was something that was probably a conscious choice by Malick, because he has said that he wanted to stay true to what he sees as the accurate history. But again, he based a lot of the movie on Smith's narrative, which is problematic from square one. It's better than Disney, who knowingly made her a sexy, buxom, and much, much older woman.
Another thing that Fallon commented on was the film's use of the Eastern Virginia Algonquin language.
They brought in this professor from UNC, Dr. Blair Roods, who really began bringing back EVA for this film. So it I think it really launched in tandem with the language revitalization movement for Powhatan people, which I think is a really important contribution that can't be ignored about sort of the power that cinema can have to do good in the world. As much power as it has to corrupt the narrative, it has money and power to do some good things as well. EVA had begun falling asleep in like the 1780s, so there had been a really long stretch of time without fluent speakers. I really just want to underline like the monumental efforts that it would take to revitalize a language like that, versus the Disney film, where someone did a little research somewhere to find a few Powhatan words that they could fit into the film, but then they were just kind of guessing at pronunciation, and in some cases the translations for the Disney film just don't wholly make sense.
Fallon also commented on Malick's effort to have more Indigenous representation in the film, but see if you can notice a common theme about these characters.
Renee Haynes was the casting director for New World, and she had also actually cast Irene Bedard in Disney's Pocahontas, and then she cast her again as Pocahontas's mother, and of course August Schellenberg, who does play Wahun Seneca or Powhatan. You have Raul Trujillo as Tomokomo, who is a very visible character, but I don't think we ever actually hear his name. And then Rulan Tangen, it says she plays Two Moons, though we not only never get to hear her name, but I've actually met Rulan in real life several times and talked with her, and even I had trouble finding her in this film. Wes Studi plays Obi-Chan Kano, who I also think we never hear his name. We do hear Matoaka call him uncle at the very end, which kind of clues you in, if you didn't already know, to who he is. Kalani Kwepo, who I have the biggest fangirl crush on, plays Pocahontas' brother Parahunt, but again, we never hear his name. Michael Grey Eyes is actually in there too, although I don't think he was maybe as visible. And of course, we also don't hear his character name ever. Of course, Koryanka Kilcher, this is kind of her debut.
Oriana Kilcher plays Pocahontas, who isn't named for most of the film.
When they name her Rebecca, once she's living in the Jamestown fort, is the first time that we hear the Pocahontas character named.
This was an intentional choice, so we talked about why he might have done this and why he waited until Pocahontas was baptized to name her in the film.
Maybe he's admitting that all he can do from his subject position is see her through this Euro-Western lens. Now, when she's named Rebecca, he can name her. But really, that is how he portrays her in the film. That is how he seems to see her. So if the name he gives her is Rebecca and that is her English name, he is certainly seeing her through that English storytelling lens. So maybe he's admitting that.
And I also noticed that we don't hear as much of her speaking about anything. We get voiceovers in the earlier part of the film, and she does definitely have a couple lines that she says to Smith, but we don't really get into her emotional psyche until she moves into James Fort. And then we start hearing lots more dialogue from her in English. So it's almost as if Malick himself didn't know or didn't understand the Pocahontas character before she comes to James Fort. So she seems kind of more elusive. And then she moves in and sort of, converts to Christianity as we see it on film, and takes the name Rebecca. And then all of a sudden, we get more of her perspective, I feel like, and we get more of her speaking.
So Malick seems to have only named characters he felt he understood from his settler colonial point of view. More broadly, I asked what they thought this film achieved or tried to accomplish, and how this could have been done better.
So I feel like Malick's film seems to be saying that he wishes that erasure and violent destruction of the Powhatan's traditional lifeway didn't happen. And yet I feel like if the goal with this film is to totally validate the Powhatan's way of life in the 17th century, then he could have done that more effectively through two major tactics. One, he could have taken up more of the Powhatan perspective and less of the English perspective. The film sort of flirts with convincing you that Pocahontas is an equal character to Smith and Rolfe because she's the only one through line, whereas the two male leads effectively split the film into two halves. However, don't be misled by this. The story is still completely from the English perspective. Even though we get voiceovers from Matoaka, we don't seem to dive into her personal life at home without Smith, as much as we get to glimpse Smith's personal life in English society and even in Powhatan society without her. So we get more of his emotional story and outlook than we do of hers. She remains this more untouchable, ethereal character for sure in the first half of the film. And so the second thing I feel like he could have done to sort of remedy this better is that he just shouldn't have based the plot on Smith's romantic revisionist narrative. It's a non-starter for a truly Indigenous perspective of this history.
At this point, it's worth talking about John Smith's writings, because this is where the myth of Pocahontas was born. I'll let Dr. Bryant explain where this myth came from.
John Smith wrote about this period a bunch of different times. He didn't mention Pocahontas every time he talked about the first years of Jamestown. He mentioned her in this book that he wrote, The General History of Virginia, New England, and the Summer Isles. And when he wrote this story, the Virginia Company was soliciting stories that could be used to paint the colonial endeavor in a more flattering light. As I mentioned, it wasn't going so well. And, as it's depicted in these films, it wasn't going so well in Jamestown. And colonists were defecting to indigenous communities, and people in England were starting to think of Virginia as this barren land where nobody could go and make a go of it. And so they weren't donating money, they weren't supporting the colonial endeavor. And so the Virginia Company was actively soliciting these narratives of, heroism and romance and what was possible in the New World. And so suddenly we get this version of those first years of Jamestown written by John Smith with this story of Pocahontas where she saves him from being executed by Powhatan, and then she helps the Jamestown settlers make a go of it through a few, devastating winters. And that came out in the 1620s. So, a significant number of years after this story supposedly took place, and after Powhatan and Pocahontas were both no longer alive. So that is when he decided to tell this story of Pocahontas and Powhatan. And so that's where this myth began, and people sort of took it, and it was very popular.
This got me wondering about whether or not it's possible to write a good version of this history that maintains the love story invented by Smith's account.
So I would say that the romance plot is basically unbearable. Other stories that we could tell about this time and place are just so much more compelling.
I'm not sure that there's any value in retaining the John Smith and Pocahontas romance narrative. Does it sell tickets to a currently uneducated audience? Yes. Do I have faith that all these same very creative minds could apply their narrative skills towards actually marketing a more historical and accurate narrative and still package it in a way that sells tickets? Yes. We could have been doing this already, except racial bias has been standing in the way. I don't know how else to put it.
For me, the question about whether this is an okay way to tell this story needs to grapple with the fact that this is a really important origin myth. Most pieces of literature that we have actually don't occupy the same place of importance in settler colonial societies in places like Canada and the United States as this story. So this story is an archetype for every story that comes after it that portrays Indigenous people as being not only without any kind of strong or significant political structure, but also as people who were essentially waiting for us to arrive so they could assimilate into our social and political structures. So the con is that we are telling and retelling this story about this weak people who, as soon as they laid eyes on us, immediately recognized us as superior beings, promising a superior life, and so they abandoned their own communities to join ours. And this was not happening in those first decades of the 17th century, as we know. Indigenous people weren't defecting to the colonies. Colonists were defecting to Indigenous communities in such numbers that they had to pass a law in England to forbid colonists from going off to live with the Powhatans. And so to me, that is a much more interesting story. And it's actually historically accurate, but we're just not interested. And I think that's a really important question. Why aren't we interested in that other story? And we instead keep telling this story of our own cultural preeminence and acting like it's a creative choice. And I don't think we can defend knowingly telling this story of our own preeminence when we've never actually tried telling a different story.
History is so fascinating as it is. You literally have no need to add any more inaccurate fluff on top of it. The fact that people feel like they need to extract the bits of history that entertain them and plug it into a fictional storyline is not as interesting to me as somebody putting their creative mind to work to say, how can we present history, an actual historical narrative, which would be educational for the public in a very real and important way, and putting their creative mind to how can we then use what we know are the tools of the industry to attract people to this real historical narrative.
So we knowingly tell this story of our own preeminence over and over again. And we still expect this of Indigenous people as settlers. We still expect them to assimilate into our societies and our power structures. And we expect this of them because we think our structures are better. And we think our structures are better because we have hidden their structures from ourselves, using these stories. And, maybe if we told better, more interesting, more accurate stories, then we would produce societies with different expectations.
The general public is inspired by representations in the media, so we have to acknowledge the power that film has to implant memories into people's minds and then harness that power for a more positive educational trajectory. I believe it's a choice that the film industry can make, and to choose to continually dishonor Indigenous people in films is a conscious choice that the film industry has already been making over and over and over again.
Both Fallon and Dr. Bryant had ideas about how a better version of this history could be put on film.
In my mind, the absolute main character would be Matoaka, and everything would be from her perspective and the Powhatan perspective. What this means functionally in a piece of performance art is that Indigenous people would have the overwhelming majority of screen time, and not from voyeuristic angles of the settler non-Indigenous gaze, but in a way that the audience feels like they understand the emotional psyche of the Indigenous characters better than any other characters, and they're more invested in the Indigenous characters. It would not include an overt romance of Matoaka and Smith as a plot anchor. Perhaps most importantly, the team making the creative decisions for the film would need to be comprised of mostly Indigenous people, and any person cast to represent an Indigenous person in the film, even as an extra, would be an Indigenous person, with first preference for casting going to people who are from the nation being represented.
I would like to see a film made about how Powhatan tried to adopt John Smith and the English into the Powhatan polity, and how Powhatan made Smith his son and gave him a fishing village and a role to play in a sophisticated political structure. And I would like to see that political structure depicted in film. And I would like to see John Smith portrayed as a villain who railed against Powhatan love and generosity and repeatedly rejected the possibility of a better, more equitable future for all of us. He did that on behalf of all of us. And I would like to see a John Smith who was not handsome. And I only comment on his appearance because of how handsome Colin Farrell is and what an absurd choice he is to play John Smith. I would love to see a film that shows John Smith to us as he was, as an arrogant, bumbling colonist who tried to catch fish with frying pans, and he grabbed stingrays out of the ocean with his bare hands. He admits all these things in his own writing. He held his gun to the heads of children and demanded provisions from people in these villages. And these are just some of the things that he openly records doing in his own writing. So why won't we let those things characterize him? Why do we need him to be this handsome hero? And I would like to see a film that shows Powhatan to us as he was, because I think that would be a great story. And remarkably, it's one we haven't heard before. Even historians, as we have discussed, are still wrapping their heads around who Powhatan was and the immense way in which he mattered, and he continues to matter. And so I would like to see a film that acknowledges Smith, the Smith who wrote the general history of Virginia, New England, and the Summer Isles, and one that incorporates those oral histories that have been mentioned as well, like Linwood Costello's The True Story of Pocahontas. So it'd be nice if the microphone was handed to someone else, if we've got another blockbuster film movie budget laying around, in a storage locker somewhere, it'd be nice to give it to some people who are interested in telling a different story, about this time and place.
The New World is a film that presents itself as more historically accurate than previous interpretations of the Pocahontas story, such as by filming in more accurate locations, casting local Indigenous actors, and utilizing Eastern Virginian Algonquin language. However, these efforts do not extend to the plot, which maintains the fictitious romance between Pocahontas and John Smith, misconstrues the circumstances by which Pocahontas was brought into Jamestown and married John Rolfe, and misrepresents the political sophistication of Powhatan society. Ultimately, Malick's The New World does not give its viewers a good history of early Virginia, though we remain hopeful that future adaptations of this story will learn from its failings.
Film makes history accessible, but you need somebody to kind of be able to peel back a lot of those layers. If you just watch this film uncritically, or if you don't have training in, how to watch this kind of colonial storytelling, this could be very misinforming.
So I would also argue that there has been a drive for more Indigenous representation on film that is finally gaining a little bit more ground. And I feel optimistic that this same audience education and social shift pattern could happen for historical accuracies in films.
If you'd like to learn more about the real life of Pocahontas, make sure to check out Fallon's video on that subject, linked in the description. Special thanks to Fallon Burner and Rachel Bryant for taking the time to speak with me, and for all of their great feedback. Our theme music is by Brook for Free. You can learn more at brookforfree.bandcamp.com.